The Lincoln Memorial, the 57-year battle to honor a murdered president. Welcome. Today I am going to tell you a story that will change the way you see one of America's most iconic monuments. You might have heard about the Lincoln Memorial before. Maybe you know it as the place where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Or perhaps you've seen it in movies, on the $5 bill, or in countless photographs with tourists climbing its marble steps. But today, I'm going to tell you the real story, the story that most history books barely touch, the story of betrayal, racism, politics, and a 57-year battle to honor a murdered president. The Lincoln Memorial is not just a building. It is a symbol of freedom, equality, and the price one man paid for trying to unite a broken nation. This is the story of Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, a man who was hated by half the country, assassinated for his beliefs, and then ignored by the very government he died trying to save. After listening to this, you will be shocked to know how America treated Lincoln after his death, how his memorial was almost never built, and how it took more than half a century of fighting, arguing, and political warfare to finally honor the man who saved the Union. This is not just a history lesson. This is a perfect story for your English listening practice. So sit back, relax, and let me take you on a journey through time. A journey of sacrifice, politics, racism, and an unforgettable legacy. Now, let's begin. The man who changed America. To understand the Lincoln Memorial, we must go back in time to the year 1861. Imagine a country torn apart, brothers fighting brothers, fathers fighting sons, a nation divided into two parts, the North and the South. The issue? Slavery. The Southern states believed they had the right to own human beings as property. The Northern states believed this was morally wrong. And caught in the middle of this nightmare was a tall, bearded lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was not born into wealth or power. He was born in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky in 1809. His family was poor. Her mother died when he was only 9 years old. He had less than 1 year of formal education. But young Abraham Lincoln had something that no school could teach, an unbreakable will to learn. He taught himself to read by candlelight. He walked miles to borrow books. He studied law on his own and became a lawyer without ever attending law school. By 1860, Lincoln had become a respected politician in Illinois. He was known for his honesty, his wit, and his powerful speeches against slavery. That year, he ran for president of the United States. The Southern states were furious. They said if Lincoln won, they would leave the Union. They would create their own country. Lincoln won the election, and just as they promised, the Southern states seceded. They formed the Confederate States of America. The Civil War had begun. For 4 long, bloody years, Americans killed each other. Over 600,000 soldiers died. It was the deadliest war in American history. Families were destroyed, cities were burned, the nation was drowning in blood. But Lincoln never gave up. He believed in one thing above all else: the Union must survive, America must remain one nation, and slavery must end. In 1863, Lincoln did something that changed America forever. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all slaves in the Confederate States were free. This was not just a military strategy, it was a moral statement. Lincoln was saying to the world, America stands for freedom, not just for some people, for all people, white and black, rich and poor, everyone. The war continued. The South fought desperately to maintain their way of life. The North fought to preserve the Union. And Lincoln, exhausted and aged beyond his years, carried the weight of every death on his shoulders. People who knew him said he rarely slept. He would walk the halls of the White House at night, tormented by the casualties, reading the names of the dead, writing letters to grieving mothers. But in April 1865, it was finally over. The Confederate Army surrendered. The Union was saved. Slavery was abolished. Lincoln had won. The nightmare was over. The country could finally heal. Finally, After 4 years of hell, there would be peace. Lincoln could rest. He could celebrate. He could enjoy the victory he had fought so hard to achieve. But life is unpredictable. Even the greatest victories can turn to tragedy in an instant. The assassination that shocked the world. It was April 14, 1865, just 5 days after the Civil War ended. Lincoln decided to do something he rarely did during the war: relax. He and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, decided to attend a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The play was called Our American Cousin, a comedy. Lincoln was looking forward to it. He needed to laugh. He needed to forget, even for just one night, the horrors of the past 4 years. The presidential box at Ford's Theater was decorated with American flags. Lincoln sat in a rocking chair, Mary beside him. The play began. The audience laughed. For a brief moment, Lincoln allowed himself to smile. He was safe. The war was over. Everything would be okay now. But in the shadows, a man was waiting. His name was John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor, handsome and charismatic, but also a Confederate sympathizer who believed Lincoln had destroyed the South. Booth had been planning this for weeks. He knew the layout of Ford's Theater. He knew when the guards changed positions. He knew exactly when to strike. At approximately 10:15 p.m., during the third act, Booth quietly entered the presidential box. He carried a small pistol. Lincoln, absorbed in the play, never heard him coming. Booth raised the gun, pointed it at the back of Lincoln's head, and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out. The audience froze. Mary screamed. Lincoln slumped forward in his chair, blood streaming from his head. Booth leaped from the box onto the stage, breaking his leg in the process. He shouted "Sic semper tyrannis," Latin for "thus always to tyrants," and then he disappeared into the night. Chaos erupted. Doctors rushed to Lincoln. They carried him across the street to a boarding house, to a small bedroom where they laid him on a bed. The bed was too short for Lincoln's tall frame, so his body lay diagonally across it. Doctors worked desperately to save him, but the bullet had penetrated too deep. There was nothing they could do. For 9 hours, Lincoln lay dying. His cabinet members, his friends, his generals, all gathered around his bedside. Mary wept uncontrollably in the next room. Outside, crowds gathered in the street, praying, crying, unable to believe what was happening. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln took his last breath. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing at the bedside, said the words that would echo through history: "Now he belongs to the ages." The man who saved the Union was gone. The man who freed the slaves was dead. The president who had guided America through its darkest hour had been murdered. The entire nation fell into mourning. But what happened next was even more shocking. The betrayal. How America abandoned Lincoln. You would think that after Lincoln's death, America would immediately honor him. You would think they would build monuments, name cities after him, create a national day of remembrance, but that's not what happened, not at all. In fact, for decades after his assassination, large portions of America wanted to forget Lincoln ever existed. The Southern states, still bitter about losing the war, hated Lincoln. They called him a tyrant. They said he had destroyed their economy, their way of life, their freedom. In their eyes, John Wilkes Booth was not an assassin, he was a hero. For many years in the South, children were taught that Lincoln was the villain of the Civil War. Streets were named after Confederate generals, not Lincoln. Statues were erected to honor Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, and other Confederate leaders, but not the man who saved the Union. But the betrayal didn't just come from the South. Even in the North, many politicians wanted to move on. They were tired of talking about the war. They wanted to focus on business, on expanding westward, on rebuilding the economy. Lincoln's legacy was complicated. He had made enemies on both sides. Some Northerners thought he had been too soft on the South, some thought he had gone too far with emancipation, and so for years Lincoln's memory was pushed aside. There was no grand memorial, no national memorial. Lincoln's body was buried in Springfield, Illinois, his hometown, in a simple tomb. That was it. The man who saved the country was given a quiet funeral and then largely forgotten by the government he had served. But there were people who remembered, people who believed Lincoln deserved more. One of those people was a sculptor named Clark Mills. In 1867, just 2 years after Lincoln's assassination, Mills proposed building a memorial to Lincoln in Washington, D.C. He created designs, presented them to Congress, and waited for approval. Congress rejected the proposal. They said it was too expensive. They said America had more important things to spend money on. Years passed. Other proposals came and went. In 1911, nearly 46 years after Lincoln's assassination, a group called the Lincoln Memorial Commission was finally formed. Their goal? To build a memorial to Abraham Lincoln in the nation's capital. But even this would not be easy. The battle was just beginning. The 57-year battle, politics, racism, and betrayal. You might think that once the commission was formed, the memorial would be built quickly. After all, Lincoln had been dead for nearly half a century. Surely everyone could agree he deserved a monument. But no, the fight over the Lincoln Memorial became one of the most bitter political battles in American history. It took 57 years from Lincoln's death to the memorial's completion. 57 years. Why so long? The first problem was location. Where should the memorial be built? Some wanted it on the National Mall, the long stretch of land in the heart of Washington, D.C. Others wanted it in a prominent location like Capitol Hill. But there was a major issue. The land at the western end of the National Mall was a swamp. It was marshy, muddy, and considered worthless. Some politicians said, "Why waste good land on a memorial? Put it somewhere else." But there was a deeper, darker reason for the resistance: racism. Many powerful politicians and citizens did not want a grand memorial to the man who freed the slaves. They especially did not want it in a prominent location where Black Americans could gather and celebrate. Remember, this was the early 1900s. Jim Crow laws were in full effect. Segregation was legal. Lynchings were common. The idea of honoring the great emancipator was deeply offensive to many white Americans, particularly in the South and even in parts of the North. The Speaker of the House, a man named Joseph Tannen, was one of the most vocal opponents. He said the memorial was a waste of money. He said Lincoln wouldn't have wanted such extravagance. But everyone knew the truth. Tannen simply didn't like Lincoln or what he stood for. For years, Tannen blocked funding for the memorial. Every time the commission requested money, Tannen found a way to delay or deny it. But the commission had a champion, Senator Shelby Moore Cullom of Illinois, Lincoln's home state. Cullom had actually met Lincoln when he was young. He had seen Lincoln's coffin during the funeral procession. He had been inspired by Lincoln his entire life. Cullom fought tirelessly for the memorial. He gave speeches. He lobbied. He refused to give up. Finally, in 1913, Congress approved $2 million for the memorial, but the battle was far from over. Next came the design. Who would design the memorial? What would it look like? The commission hired an architect named Henry Bacon. Bacon proposed something radical: a Greek temple. Yes, a Greek temple like the Parthenon in Athens. Many people were shocked. They said, "Why are we building a Greek temple for an American president? Lincoln was born in a log cabin, not a palace. This doesn't make sense." But Bacon had a vision. He said the Greek temple represented democracy. Ancient Greece was the birthplace of democracy, and Lincoln had saved democracy in America. The design was symbolic. Lincoln, like the ancient Greek philosophers, believed in government of the people, by the people, for the people. The temple would show that Lincoln's legacy was eternal, just like the monuments of ancient Greece. The commission agreed. Henry Bacon would design the memorial, but they needed a sculptor for the statue of Lincoln himself. They chose Daniel Chester French, one of America's greatest sculptors. French had one job: create a statue of Lincoln that captured his strength, his sadness, his humanity. It had to be perfect. It had to show the world who Lincoln really was. French spent months studying photographs of Lincoln. He read Lincoln's letters. He talked to people who had known him. And then he began sculpting. He decided to show Lincoln sitting, not standing. Lincoln's hands would rest on the arms of a chair, one hand clenched in a fist, representing his strength, the other open, representing his compassion. Lincoln's face would be serious, thoughtful, burdened by the weight of leadership, but also resolute. This was not a triumphant king. This was a tired man who had carried the weight of a nation. But while the design was being finalized, something terrible was happening in Washington, D.C., something that would reveal the ugly truth about America. The dark secret: segregation at the memorial. Construction of the Lincoln Memorial began in 1914. Workers poured the foundation. They hauled massive blocks of marble from quarries across America. White marble from Colorado for the exterior, pink marble from Tennessee for the floor, Indiana limestone for the interior walls. It was a monumental task. Over the next 8 years, hundreds of workers, including many black laborers, toiled to build the memorial. The irony was not lost on anyone: black workers building a monument to the man who freed their ancestors. But here is where the story takes a dark turn. Even as the memorial was being built to honor Lincoln, the man who fought for equality, America was still deeply segregated, and the people in charge of the memorial's construction did not want black Americans involved in the ceremonies. They did not want black workers to be recognized. They did not want black citizens to have prominent seating at the dedication ceremony. This was America in the 1920s, and racism was the law of the land. In 1922, the Lincoln Memorial was finally completed. The dedication ceremony was scheduled for May 30, 1922, Memorial Day. It would be a grand event. President Warren G. Harding would speak. Former President William Howard Taft, who was now Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, would attend. Thousands of people would gather to witness the unveiling of the statue. But there was a problem. The organizers decided that the seating at the ceremony would be segregated. White attendees would sit in the front, near the memorial. Black attendees would be forced to sit in a separate section, far away, across a road, behind a barrier. Even though black Americans had fought for the Union in the Civil War, even though their ancestors had been freed by Lincoln, they were not welcome to sit with white Americans at the ceremony honoring the man who had given his life for their freedom. One man was invited to speak at the ceremony: Dr. Robert Russa Moton, the president of Tuskegee Institute, a prominent black college. Moton was chosen because the organizers wanted to appear inclusive, but when Moton arrived and saw the segregated seating, he was furious. He considered refusing to speak, but in the end, he decided to use the opportunity to send a message. When Moton took the podium, he did not sugarcoat his words. He spoke directly about the hypocrisy of the day. He said, "We stand here today beneath the shadow of this great memorial dedicated to a man who believed in freedom and equality. But look around. Look at how we are divided, even now, even here. If Lincoln were alive, he would weep to see this." The audience fell silent. Many white attendees were uncomfortable, but Moton continued. He said black Americans had earned the right to be treated as equals, and that Lincoln's legacy demanded it. His speech was powerful, but it changed nothing. After the ceremony, segregation continued. Black Americans were still treated as second-class citizens. The Lincoln Memorial stood as a symbol of freedom, but America was still not free. But over time, something unexpected happened. The memorial became a rallying point for justice. The memorial that became a battlefield for justice.
In the decades following its dedication, the Lincoln Memorial transformed from a tribute to a dead president into something much more powerful, a stage for justice. It became the place where Americans gathered to demand the equality that Lincoln had died fighting for. It became a battlefield, not of guns and soldiers, but of words, protests, and dreams.
The first major event happened in 1939. A world-renowned black opera singer named Marian Anderson was scheduled to perform a concert in Washington, D.C. She was one of the greatest singers of her generation, with a voice that could move audiences to tears. But when she tried to book Constitution Hall, the most prestigious concert venue in the city, she was denied. Why? Because Constitution Hall was owned by the Daughters of the American Revolution, and they had a whites-only policy. They refused to let a black woman perform on their stage. The news caused outrage. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, was so disgusted that she publicly resigned from the Daughters of the American Revolution. She said she would not be part of an organization that practiced racism. But Eleanor didn't stop there. She worked with the NAACP and the Secretary of the Interior to arrange for Marian Anderson to perform somewhere even more significant, the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. On April 9, 1939, Easter Sunday, Marian Anderson stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and sang. Behind her, the massive statue of Lincoln looked down. In front of her, more than 75,000 people gathered on the National Mall. Millions more listened on the radio. Anderson opened with "My Country, 'Tis of Thee." Her voice, rich and powerful, echoed across the mall. People wept. It was a moment of defiance, of beauty, of hope. Here at the memorial to the man who freed the slaves, a black woman was declaring to the world, "I belong here. We belong here. This is our country too." But the most iconic moment in the Lincoln Memorial's history was still to come. The dream that changed America. By the early 1960s, America was in the midst of the civil rights movement. Black Americans, led by figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., were fighting for their rights. They were marching, protesting, sitting in at segregated lunch counters, and demanding an end to Jim Crow laws. The movement was gaining momentum, but it faced fierce resistance. Police attacked protesters with dogs and fire hoses. Segregationists bombed churches. Civil rights leaders were arrested, beaten, and murdered. On August 28, 1963, organizers planned a massive demonstration in Washington, D.C. It was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The goal was to demand civil rights legislation and economic equality. Organizers hoped for 100,000 people to attend. But on that hot summer day, more than 250,000 people showed up. It was the largest protest in American history at that time. And where did they gather? At the Lincoln Memorial. People filled the National Mall. They stood in the reflecting pool to cool off. They sang freedom songs. They carried signs that read, "We march for jobs" and "End segregation now." And at the end of the day, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. walked to the podium at the Lincoln Memorial and delivered a speech that would change the world. King began with prepared remarks. He talked about the injustices Black Americans faced. He talked about the promissory note of freedom that had been written by the Founding Fathers, but never honored for Black citizens. His words were powerful, but they were also measured, almost academic. And then something incredible happened. Gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, standing near King, called out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." King paused. He looked out at the sea of faces before him. He set aside his prepared speech, and then, speaking from his heart, he began to improvise. "I have a dream," he said. The crowd leaned forward. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The crowd erupted in cheers.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. People wept. They shouted, "Amen." They waved their signs. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. The power of his words was undeniable. King spoke with a rhythm, a cadence, almost like a preacher delivering a sermon. His voice rose and fell. Behind him, the statue of Lincoln looked down, as if bearing witness, as if Lincoln himself were listening, as if the great emancipator were nodding in approval. King finished with the words that would echo for generations. "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last." The crowd exploded. People cheered, cried, embraced. It was a moment of pure, raw emotion, and it happened at the Lincoln Memorial. The place that had been built amid controversy and racism had become the backdrop for the most important speech in the history of the civil rights movement. Less than a year later, in 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, outlawing segregation and discrimination. The dream that Lincoln had died for was finally becoming a reality. But the Lincoln Memorial holds more than just history. It holds secrets, mysteries that few people know about, strange details that make this monument even more fascinating. First, let's talk about the statue itself. Daniel Chester French's sculpture of Lincoln is 19 feet tall and weighs 175 tons. It is carved from 28 blocks of white Georgia marble. But here's something most people don't know. Lincoln's hands are not random. French sculpted them to form letters in American Sign Language. Lincoln's right hand forms the letter A for Abraham. His left hand forms the letter L for Lincoln. Some historians debate if this was intentional or coincidental, but many believe French did this as a tribute to Lincoln's compassion for people with disabilities.
Second, there is a hidden chamber beneath the memorial. Yes, a secret room. During construction, workers carved out a large underground space beneath the statue. Today, it is filled with stalactites, mineral formations that hang from the ceiling like icicles because water has seeped through the marble over the decades. Graffiti from workers who built the memorial can still be seen on the walls. The chamber is not open to the public, but it exists like a hidden layer of history beneath the monument. Third, look closely at Lincoln's face. If you stare at it long enough, some people say you can see a face in Lincoln's hair, specifically the face of Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general. Is it real? Is it intentional? Probably not. It's likely just pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in random patterns. But the legend persists. Some say the sculptor, Daniel Chester French, included it as a symbol of reconciliation between North and South. Others say it's pure coincidence. You'll have to visit and decide for yourself. Fourth, the words carved into the walls of the memorial are not just decorations. On the north wall is Lincoln's second inaugural address, one of the most powerful speeches in American history. On the south wall is the Gettysburg Address, where Lincoln famously said, "Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." But here's the interesting part. When the Gettysburg Address was first carved, there was a typo. The word future was misspelled as eacher. The carvers had to fill in the mistake and recarved a letter F. If you look closely, you can still see the repair. Fifth, the Lincoln Memorial has appeared in more movies, TV shows, and photographs than almost any other monument in America. It has been featured in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Forrest Gump, Planet of the Apes, The Simpsons, and countless others. It has become a symbol not just of Lincoln, but of America itself. But perhaps the most powerful secret of the Lincoln Memorial is this: it was never supposed to exist. It was fought against, delayed, underfunded, and resisted for nearly 6 decades. And yet, it stands, it endures, and it has become one of the most important places in American history. The memorial today, a living monument. Today, the Lincoln Memorial is visited by more than 7 million people every year. Tourists from all over the world climb its 57 steps, one for each year between Lincoln's death and the memorial's completion. They stand before the statue of Lincoln, craning their necks to look up at his face. They read the inscriptions on the walls. They take photos. They feel something. But the Lincoln Memorial is more than just a tourist attraction. It is still a place where people gather to fight for justice. In recent years, it has been the site of protests for immigration reform, LGBTQ+ rights, climate change action, and countless other causes. Just as Marian Anderson and Martin Luther King Jr. used it as a stage for equality, modern activists continue to use it as a rallying point. The memorial has become a living monument, not frozen in time, but constantly evolving, constantly relevant. And that is the true power of the Lincoln Memorial. It is not just a tribute to a dead president, it is a reminder of what Lincoln stood for: equality, freedom, and the belief that all people are created equal. It is a reminder that progress is never easy, that change requires sacrifice, that the fight for justice is never truly over. Lincoln himself never saw the memorial. He never knew that 57 years after his death, a massive temple would be built in his honor. He never knew that his statue would become one of the most recognizable images in the world. He never knew that people would travel from every corner of the globe just to stand in his presence. But perhaps he would have appreciated the irony. Lincoln, the man who was born in a log cabin, who taught himself to read, who was ridiculed for his appearance and his humble origins, now sits in a grand temple, immortalized in marble, honored by millions. The man who was hated by half the country during his life is now revered as one of the greatest Americans who ever lived. The legacy that lives forever. The story of the Lincoln Memorial is not just about a building, it is about the struggle to honor a man who gave everything for his country. It is about the racism, politics, and betrayal that nearly prevented the memorial from being built. It is about the irony of segregating the dedication ceremony of a monument to the great emancipator. And it is about the transformation of that monument into a symbol of hope, justice, and the ongoing fight for equality. Abraham Lincoln once said, "In the end, it's not the years in your life that count, it's the life in your years." Lincoln lived only 56 years, but in those years, he saved the Union, freed the slaves, and redefined what America could be. His life was cut short by an assassin's bullet, but his legacy lives on. The Lincoln Memorial stands as proof that even in death, Lincoln's influence endures. It stands as proof that great leaders are not always appreciated in their time, but history will honor them. It stands as proof that symbols matter, that monuments matter, that remembering the past is essential to building a better future. When you stand before the Lincoln Memorial, you are not just looking at a statue, you are looking at the embodiment of sacrifice. You are looking at the price of freedom. You are looking at a man who believed so deeply in equality that he was willing to die for it, and he did. The Lincoln Memorial is a reminder that the work Lincoln started is not finished. Equality is still a dream for many. Justice is still a struggle. Freedom is still a fight, but as long as the memorial stands, as long as people gather at its steps to demand change, as long as Lincoln's words are carved into its walls, there is hope. People from all over the world visit this breathtaking monument. Historians study its symbolism. Architects admire its design. Children learn about the man it honors. And every person who stands before it feels something. They feel the weight of history. They feel the power of one man's belief in a better world. They feel inspired. And that is why the Lincoln Memorial will live forever, not because of its marble and stone, but because of what it represents. It represents the idea that one person can change the world. It represents the belief that equality is worth fighting for. It represents the hope that no matter how dark the times, progress is possible. Abraham Lincoln is gone, but his memorial remains, and as long as it stands, his dream of a more perfect union will never die. This is the story of the Lincoln Memorial, a story of love for country, sacrifice for principle, and the fight to honor a fallen hero. It is a story that proves that even the most powerful legacies can be challenged, but if they are built on truth and justice, they will endure. And this, my friends, is why the Lincoln Memorial will stand forever.